It's late at night, with everyone sleeping. The stars are shining and not a sound is to be heard except the crickets chirping. Suddenly you hear a blood-curdling scream from the next house over and you think your neighbour has finally snapped and has started their murdering spree. Unfortunately, a much worse fate has befallen your neighbour. They have had to play the game that will be looked at today, Bubsy 3D. Now, when first looking at this game, you may be thinking to yourself, well, those students did a decent job on the information technology assignment, which leaves me saying that a group of adults made this game. You may also be thinking that I shouldn't be so harsh on the very first 3D platformer made, but I also need to inform you that this game came out after Crash Bandicoot and Super Mario 64. Instead of doing something sensible like improving their game, these developers thought the shit stain of a game was perfectly fine to be put out, and still, to this day, they believe it's a good game. I don't know how delirious or brain dead these folks are, but if I were the developers and saw how much better those other games I mentioned earlier were, my balls would retract right back into my body and I would scamper down the dark, dirty hole I crawled out of to fix this atrocity. Now, as per usual, before completely ripping this game to shreds, I'll have a look at the covers. Oh, this game was so desperate to be taken seriously that it had to put all the positive words ever said about it on the cover, completely out of context. Maybe the original quotes would have looked something like this. You may be surprised to know that the Gold X award was really given, but considering I'm sure everyone has heard of PS Extreme these days, that award should be taken with the utmost respect. Now, quickly, having a look at the back cover, I'd like to note that the developers thought that being compared to Super Mario 64 would automatically mean that it would be in a positive light. But you see, the underwater levels in that game, and any platformer games in general, are almost universally hated. The flimsy story of this game is that Bubsy has crash landed on the planet of the Woolies, which must be a planet full of untextured polygons and bland backgrounds, because I can't think of any other excuse as to why the developers thought this pre-alpha looking game would be fine in its current state. This game is the bare minimum requirement of being able to be called 3D, because sure, while you can walk around in a 3D plane, the environments are so flat and lifeless, you may as well be playing a two-dimensional game. You know how, if you watch too much television, someone might say you go square-eyed? Well, if you play this game for too long, you will definitely go square-eyed, because all the time you're playing this game, you'll never see any other shapes. They're so lazy with their graphics that Bubsy's shadow is just an octagon. Similar to his environments, Bubsy as a character is flat and two-dimensional, with his only discernible feature as being funny. This comedy extends to berating the player, commenting on obvious things within the environment, and having puns within the level titles. Oh, the developers made those level names, not Bubsy. I guess his only character trait is annoying the ever-living shit out of the player. This game contradicts itself a lot, which is immediately seen in the introductory cutscene where the Woolly General believes that the atoms and rocket parts are completely useless, even though they're the main items you collect during the game. Like, did the Woolies just think that the creature that just crash-landed a rocket onto their planet, who started collecting rocket parts, would find no use for them whatsoever? Well, in all reality, they aren't really rocket parts that you collect, they're just miniature rockets. So I'm assuming to escape, Bubsy was just going to strap all the rockets he collects together and hope being exposed to space wouldn't kill him. When you collect the rockets, the screen quickly flashes colours, as if the game is trying to aggravate every demographic with its visuals by potentially trying to hospitalise any epileptics that may be playing this game. Well, in all fairness, being hospitalised for having an epileptic fit would be an improvement in the quality of life for that person after having to play this game. Another way the game contradicts itself involves the collection of any hidden items in the game, such as the aforementioned rocket parts and extra lives. You see, the objective of each stage is to simply make it to the end of the level, which further pushes the idea that the rockets are useless, even though the collection of all rocket parts grants the good ending. Well, my terrible game senses were tinkling, and they told me that it wouldn't be worth the extra time and pain playing this game to collect all the rocket parts, just to see a different end cutscene. Oh boy was I right, because the only difference in the end cutscene is a few lines of dialogue at the start, and the Woolies invade Earth regardless. In fact, forget what I said before, the rocket parts are worthless after all, and I suppose the game was warning us all along not to waste our time collecting these parts. Wait, then why would the game remind me that I missed collecting rockets at the end of each level? Well, I can't blame a game that has an identity crisis because it can't decide if it wants to have linear or open-ended levels. You see, littered throughout the levels are arrows pointing towards the end because I'm sure at some stage during the development cycle, the developers realised how impossible it would be for players to navigate these god-awful untextured environments. To help you find the collectibles are telescopes that show you where in the level you can find it. The thing is, you still don't have enough information to find the collectible because you still need to navigate these confusing levels, leaving you with more of a chance of fucking a supermodel after shitting yourself in front of them to finding that collectible, which is just yet another reason to add onto the list of why the rocket parts are useless as collectibles now due to their confusing obtainability. Another area the game likes to contradict itself in is whenever water is involved, because whenever platforming is required over water, Bubsy will die if he falls into it, but then there are water levels that showcase he is perfectly capable of swimming. Sure, he has diving equipment on in those levels, but you don't need that sort of equipment when you can just doggy paddle to the water's edge. Oh wait, Bubsy's a bobcat. Maybe he can't doggy paddle, but you know where I was going with that point. Additionally, when being too close to the platform's edge when over water, Bubsy will enter an animation where he hovers in the air and waves goodbye as a sort of callback to an old Looney Tunes cartoons. The difference between the two is that, unlike Bubsy, the characters of Looney Tunes are beloved by many and feature in successful series. Talking about the water levels, it is never explained how Bubsy got underwater or got any equipment on. Sure, there are transitionary cutscenes at the end of the levels that occasionally explain how Bubsy gets from place to place, but never for the underwater levels, making the game even more confusing. However, I find these cutscenes to be the most enjoyable thing out of the game because, as most of them feature Bubsy hurt in some way. What I don't enjoy is the game's game over screens, where Bubsy is still getting hurt, sure, but he stares straight at the player as to blame you for his death, even though the controls were the reason for his death. Well, these controls, there's something else, with Bubsy feeling like a nailed down piece of soap. Now, what I mean by that is the game is both stiff and slippery at the same time. Similar to people who after a 100-meter sprint run another 50 meters because they can't slow down, when Bubsy gets any momentum behind him, he does the same, often slamming into walls because he simply won't stop. Then, when it comes to any other movement other than walking forward, the controls are stiffer than an old man who got rigor mortis after dying at the strip club when popping a Viagra. I say this simply because this game uses tank controls, which requires you to stop in place and use left or right on the D-pad to turn Bubsy into a new direction you want to go forward in. The rigid feel of the game is found with the camera, as well because it can't be controlled by the player, it barely moves, and it never seems to look at anything important on the screen. In fact, the only time the camera ever moves is when Bubsy is damaged in some way, and it dizzyingly swings to the front of Bubsy, as if the cameraman hates Bubsy and wants to get a closer look at the damage done. Unfortunately, getting hit stops Bubsy in his tracks, and if you're getting hit jumping across the platform, then you can look forward to falling down and trying those jumps all over again. The problem with most of the projectiles that get shot at you during this game is that they're smaller than my left nut, and with the terrible camera, you have about as much of a chance of seeing them as a blind man. Talking about the blind, the game must assume you're blind due to it playing a musical cue, warning you that there is an enemy nearby. Maybe they're trying to compensate for the game's atrocious draw distance, but considering that most levels have enemies around every corner, you're going to hear that grating sound a lot during the playthrough. The most confusing aspect of this game is the fact that the woolies are the most frequently seen enemies, and they are the most pussy antagonists in any game, looking like a sock puppet that came to life and tried to be threatening. The only feasible way of defeating enemies is to grab the atoms in the level and throw them at the enemy. The problem with that is, trying to stop in front of the atom results in you collecting the atoms and continuing to run for half of the level. So the best way of going about this is holding down the circle button, which is the button required to pick up atoms and walk up to the atom. It seems even the atoms hate Bubsy, because if he doesn't throw the atom after a while, it'll explode and harm him. The other way of defeating enemies is jumping on them, but is only viable if you have no atoms left or accidentally collected them, simply because shooting atoms is easier to control, therefore more likely to defeat the enemy. When you jump, the camera swings down, which it is helpful for trying to land on the enemy and to an extent platforming. Now what it isn't helpful for is trying to jump your way through a group of enemies, because trying to use the normal walking controls is too slow and unusable, and with the camera constantly pointing down, you can't see where anything is. Now this leaves me saying, if any other movement system in your game is more viable to use than walking, you have one seriously broken game if you can't get those basics down pat. Surprisingly enough, this game has boss fights, and similar to the rest of the game, they're just as confusing and painful to deal with. The first boss is defeated by using the glide move on the damaged floor after being shot by a projectile, which would be obvious to any intellect such as myself, because of course we all thought to ourselves that Bubsy could use the heat wave left over from the damaged floor to glide up and damage the boss. Although it raises the question of, how can Bubsy, a bobcat, possibly be able to glide? What, did he get bitten by a radioactive flying squirrel to get those sort of powers? The second boss is defeated by allowing him to slip on banana peels to slip out of the arena into acid. In order to get any more bananas, you need to damage the boss. So, did the crowd watching this fight think to themselves that the boss's potassium levels must be lacking and that's why he's getting hurt? Then why keep throwing bananas into the arena if the boss just keeps flipping on them all the time? I would mention the last two bosses, strange and backwards way of defeating them, but they're vanquished the same way as any other enemy. It's as if the developers finally realised that in order to defeat these bosses, you shouldn't have a degree in thinking backwards and majoring how the fuck was I meant to figure out how that works. Talking about levels that deviate from the usual monotony of the rest of the platforming levels, the underwater levels are, sadly enough, the best part of the game. While they are the best part of the game, they still have piss poor controls, but have the added bonus of not having to worry about platforming and worrying about simply reaching the end. Enemies are a lot harder to kill, but considering I can swim right past them a lot easier than I can run right past them, I feel as if that's a sorta, kinda, not really fair trade-off in this game. Well, I never thought I'd say this, but the best part of a platforming game is the water levels. Yeah, that's really something the developers should hang their heads in shame over. In conclusion, Bubsy 3D feels like the prototype for the 3D platformer that got released with no testing done in any department before it was greenlit. Again, I have to mention, it's sad to see a game include 3D in its title to be so flat and lifeless. Nothing in this game felt like it had any effort put into it, and it feels like the developers put more effort into the title card of their company name in the intro than anything else. With that being said, it is not the worst game so far, but it came very close. Unlike Catfight, I got some enjoyment out of seeing Bubsy suffer in the connecting level cutscenes, which shows how close these games are to me in terms of quality. Here are the ranking of the game so far. Play another one of these games. I would ask for you to like this video, but I'd rather you give me money to help me pay for the clinics I'll need to go to after all the trauma this game has induced on me.